All right, today, guys, I'm going to explain the moss life cycle, which is a really good example of how some plants and some other organisms go through what's called alternation of generations. So I have this picture here that kind of goes through the whole cycle, but I want to give you a real life example too. So this is what you probably have seen on rocks and things, and kind of darker places. It's moss, kind of simple green moss, and if you look closely, you can actually break apart the moss into little individual moss plants. They're actually really, really tiny, and that would be one little moss plant. But they kind of live all together because they reproduce pretty quickly. And I'm making a mess here. But then sometimes in the year, if you look closely at the moss, it turns into this thing, which kind of looks like there's spikes all over the place. And it's really it's these are the reproductive structures, or some of the reproductive structures that allow it to go through an alternation of generations. So let's go through the process. I'll go through it real quick so you can replay this as many times as you want. But I always like to talk and start talking about the spores. So the spores that are released are haploid, and they actually are removed and come out of the top of these spiky looking things. But we're going to get to that when we get all the way back around to the life cycle. So spores land somewhere, either getting blown off from the wind, or if it rains, it's a really good source of how these things are released. And then they land somewhere, and then they germinate, and then they grow by mitosis. Now, some of these spores are going to be female, and some of these spores are going to be male. And you really won't be able to tell until later in the cycle. So let's follow this arrow. It says grows by mitosis or germination. Germination is when the spore starts to grow. And this one over here is going to grow into a little tiny green moss plant. And this one happens to be a microgametophyte, which is the male plant. The micro is referring to the sperm that it's creating, so it's the male plant. And on top of this little tiny moss plant, we have a structure called the antheridium, which is still haploid because the spores are haploid. So it's a haploid cell that divides by mitosis and makes more cells by mitosis, but in the structure at the top called the antheridium. And this is one key difference here. The sperm is generated by mitosis, not meiosis, as in like mammals or other more familiar organisms. Sperm is formed by mitosis, not meiosis. If we follow this arrow down, this will lead us to the female form. It's called the megagametophyte, mega is referring to the size of the egg, which is larger than the sperm. So that's why the mega is referred to the megagametophyte, the female plant. It's still haploid, and it has a structure on the top of it called the archegonium, which creates the egg, also formed by mitosis. Now, these things do not have any things growing out of the top, like those spiky little moss plants that I showed you. These are just the green common moss plants. At some point in the year, these are going to mature. The sperm and the egg are going to mature, and it needs rain. It needs water for the sperm to be transported from this plant to this plant, and that's shown by this. It says water transports sperm to the egg. Sperm will fertilize the egg and form a zygote, and that's the diploid stage. That's the first cell, the diploid stage. So the term alternation of generations refers to that some of the life, like the structures that make up this plant's life, the entire organism is made up of haploid cells. These two green plants, every cell in that organism is haploid. Then sperm fertilizes the egg, makes a diploid zygote, and that zygote's actually found on top of the megagametophyte inside the archegonium, because the egg doesn't move, the sperm got here by the water. That's going to fertilize and form our first diploid cell, and then the zygote will grow by mitosis, but it will keep the little green thing below it. This will grow into this brown structure. Kind of looks like spikes on that actual moss. I'll bring it back out here. Each one of those spikes is a stalk and a sporangium. Every single cell in this um, structure is diploid because it grew from a diploid zygote. This entire brown structure is the sporophyte. In the top of this little capsule, the sporangium, this is where meiosis occurs, not to create sperm or egg, but to create the spores back to haploid cells, back to female or male cells. We don't really know until they start to germinate, and then the cycle continues again. So for this part of its lifetime, this bottom portion is still haploid. The top portion is now the diploid stage, and that's where the term alternating generations comes from. It's alternating between haploid cells and diploid cells.